In 1959, Singapore faced an existential housing crisis. One-third of the population lived in overcrowded shophouses or squatter settlements. The newly elected PAP government inherited a nation where basic shelter was a luxury most couldn't afford. It seemed like an almost impossible task. House 2 million people with almost no resources. The ruling party's solution would become the world's most successful public housing program, housing about 85% of Singapore's population today. But 6 decades later, the same system now faces a contradiction that threatens its very foundation. Singapore's public housing has gone through 4 big shifts, and understanding these shifts reveal why the system that once solved homelessness may now be creating a different kind of crisis. So let's trace them and see how the story of its success created today's contradictions. And before we begin, welcome to What Makes a Country. I'm Kian Chong, your host, and on this channel, we uncover the hidden architecture behind successful countries. Our focus is on the policies, institutions, and businesses that create lasting, thriving societies. Let's start with the first shift, the foundation. The instrument used by the colonial government to provide low-cost housing since the 1930s was the Singapore Improvement Trust, SIT. Across more than a decade from 1947 to 1959, the SIT had only built 20,000 housing and shop units. It was too slow, too small scale, and too conservative for the scale of Singapore's crisis, especially the post-war baby boom and mass migration to the city. Many expected that the PAP government would minimally continue with some of the staff that had prior experience in planning on the construction, but they dissolved the SIT entirely, dismissing it as a bloated and corrupt colonial establishment. The HDB began with a completely clean slate of local staff, many without any experience. When it was established in 1960, its mission was singular: provide basic shelter for the masses. The early flats reflected this utilitarian vision: one-room rental units in 7-story walk-up blocks. The HDB even called them emergency flats, reflecting their temporary nature. Dr. Goh King Swee had learned from the failures of socialist housing elsewhere. He insisted that the scheme should not be run on a subsidized basis. It should at least give a reasonable return to capital invested. Lee Kuan Yew also understood something deeper. Ownership creates loyalty. If people own their homes, they'll fight for their country. The pivot came in 1964 with the home ownership scheme. Instead of bleeding money on rental housing indefinitely, Singapore would sell 99-year leases to residents. Initially, uptake was modest. Only about 1,500 households out of 11,000 public housing tenants opted for ownership. Everything changed in 1968 when residents could use their CPF savings. Families who couldn't afford a flat could now own one without suffering any reduction in monthly disposable income. The scale of what followed was unprecedented. Between 1966 and 1970, Singapore built 66,000 public housing flats, roughly one new home every 40 minutes, for a population of just 2 million people. On a per capita basis, this was one of the most intense public housing drive of its time, unmatched by larger nations. Lim Kim San helmed the charge. When suppliers tried to form a cartel to jack up sand and gravel prices, he undercut them by opening HDB's own granite and sand quarries. It sent a clear message: nothing would stand in the way of building at scale. By 1969, one-third of Singapore's population lived in HDB flats. The foundation of all this was cheap land. Land was effectively nationalized. It all started with the introduction of the Land Acquisition Act in 1966. Low rates were paid as the government argued that private landowners should not be entitled to any financial windfall from land that benefited from public investments. The stage was now set. Housing was affordable, accessible, and self-funding. Annual subsidy of no more than 3% of the annual budget in the first 20 years. But at this point, it was still about one thing: putting roofs over heads. But then, a decision in 1971 would reshape the housing system entirely. Shift 2. The liberation. Previously, HDB owners who wanted to move had to sell back to the government at predetermined prices. This kept the system closed and controlled. This restrictive policy was changed radically by permitting an owner to sell their existing flat in the open market and realize profits before buying a second new subsidized flat from the HDB. The change seemed logical. Families could upgrade to larger flats as their circumstances improved, or families got larger as a result of the post-war boom. Housing stock would be allocated more efficiently as well. For the first time, public housing became a tradable asset with market-determined prices. The minimum occupation period (MOP) was 3 years, and the demurrage period for buying another subsidized flat was another year. Singaporeans embraced this new reality with enthusiasm. The 1970s also saw the introduction of void decks in HDBs, pioneered by Liu Tai-ke, to create human scale in the middle of all the high-rises. The government also stepped in to fill the housing gap for the sandwich class, people who earn too much to qualify for regular HDB flats, but not enough to comfortably afford private property, all served by the HUDC, the Housing and Urban Development Company. The 1980s brought forth the ethnic integration policy, which set radical quotas on flat ownership within each block and neighbourhood based on the ethnic makeup of Singapore. The decade also saw executive flats and aesthetic innovations, buildings and neighbourhoods distinguished by colour, curved balconies, and distinctive architectural motifs. Sloping roofs in Potong Pasir and street architecture like bus stops in Pasir Ris, with distinctive blue and white curved roofs. But the real transformation here was financial. By 1989, over 80% of Singaporeans were living in public housing. Property fever has started to grip Singapore. At the height of the boom, 150,000 buyers queued for new flats. Wait times stretched to sometimes even up to 7 years. HDB flats were no longer just homes. They were becoming the primary wealth-building vehicle for Singaporeans. Then, in 1997, the Asian financial crisis struck. Shift 3, the balancing act. Singapore's housing market collapsed virtually overnight. Those 150,000 people queues vanished. HDB was left with 31,000 unsold flats gathering dust. Homeowners paid a heavy price, with flat prices staying depressed. Some who had bought flats just before the crisis ended up with negative equity and even lost their homes and hard-earned savings. Mabao Tan, who became Minister for National Development in 1999, had to tackle the crisis. HDB had to come up with all sorts of ways to clear the flats, converting 5-room and executive flats into smaller 2 to 3-room ones, organising roadshows, implementing walk-in selection of the ready flats, and engaging managing agents to rent out unsold flats temporarily. Because of the unintended oversupply, home buyers could walk in to buy ready flats in the early 2000s. Almost every year until 2006, Member of Parliament expressed concerns about the unsold stock, the minister later wrote. The solution to better balance supply and demand was the build-to-order system, or more commonly known as BTO, introduced in 2001. The BTO system brought more sophistication to supply management. Projects typically don't launch until they are about 70 to 80% subscribed, allowing HDB to gauge real demand before committing resources. It was also an upgrade in the purchasing journey of new homeowners. The previous registration for flat system (RFS) only allowed buyers to select the broad geographical zone of the desired flat location. However, the exact location as well as the cost of the flat was only made known when buyers were invited to select their flats. Buyers were unable to predict their flat's exact completion date, and some did not even have the means to pay the down payment when their flats were completed earlier than anticipated. Some buyers were also unhappy with the final location of their flats. The BTO system addressed this by letting buyers know upfront when their down payment was expected and giving them the flexibility of selecting the location and type of flats desired. But the system also introduced a supply dynamic that chronically lags behind demand that kept prices slowly rising. By the 2000s, Singapore faced a new challenge. Elders who had benefited from the increase in prices came to be known as cash poor but asset rich. A retiree might own $500,000 flat but have only $50,000 in their CPF. The demographic shift in Singapore towards an aging society made retirement adequacy especially pressing by unlocking housing equity of the elders who had contributed to nation building. While selling and downsizing might seem like a good option, many elders preferred staying in familiar neighbourhoods which they have built around their entire life and near to their own support networks. The most visible attempt by the government to address this was the lease buyback scheme launched in 2009. introduced to help Singaporean seniors aged 65 and above monetize their HDB flats by selling part of their remaining lease back to the HDB, while continuing to live in the same unit for the retained lease period. The scheme originally applied only to the owners of 3-room or smaller flats. Eligibility progress expanded to include 4 and 5-room units over the years. This was quickly followed by the Silver Housing Bonus in 2012, designed to encourage elderly couples to downsize and to move nearer to their children and unlock housing equity. Maintaining the value of aging estates was also not left out. HDB implemented further upgrading and refurbishments, such as the Home Improvement Program, which subsidizes elder-friendly renovations, such as spalling concrete and toilets, and the Neighborhood Renewal Program, that give entire towns comprehensive makeovers with improved landscaping, community facilities and accessibility features, like barrier-free access for the elderly. The HDB was managing the tightrope delicately until a black swan event overwhelmed the system. Shift 4. The contradiction. The very matching of demand to supply that prevented oversupply, as we saw during the Asian financial crisis, also meant undersupply when demand unexpectedly surged as it did during the COVID-19 pandemic. The BTO system that tries to tread the tightrope between supply and demand finds it difficult to operate in a volatile environment. The BTO supply built in chronically lagging supply. But when global supply chains faced disruptions, and foreign worker dormitories had massive infections, and construction delay created a perfect storm, projects that should have been completed in 3 to 4 years began stretching to 5 to 6 years. With suppressed supply meeting pent-up demand, resale prices surged. This wasn't unique to Singapore. Housing markets worldwide experienced similar dynamics during the pandemic. But in Singapore, the impact was amplified by the dual mandate system. When public housing appreciates rapidly, it serves the retirement nest egg mandate brilliantly. Existing homeowners grew wealthier on paper and can better fund their retirement from housing equity, but it undermines the affordability mandate. Young families find themselves priced out of the very system designed to house them. One major attempt to balance the contradiction is the introduction of more housing grants and subsidies. The maximum enhanced CPF housing grant for first-time families rose from $80,000 to $120,000. Combined with other schemes like the CPF housing grant and proximity housing grant, eligible first-time families buying resale flats can now receive up to $230,000 in total grants, and singles up to $1,100 and $15,000. These aren't small tweaks. They are significant injections aimed at preserving affordability even in the face of rising prices and supply delays. These grants aren't the only tool in the arsenal. The government is also going all in on supply, answering escalating demand with action. Remember the building surge of the 1960s? Between 1965 and 1970, HDB built around 60,000 flats in 5 years. Today we're seeing the government push way past that speed, with around 100,000 BTO flats from 2021 to 2025, all sped up with prefabricated components. HDB had also launched an increasing number of shorter waiting time flats, so that applicants can usually move in within 3 years. From 2025 to 2027, the government plans to launch 12,000 SWT flats, and the government finds itself walking an increasingly difficult tightrope between flats as affordable homes or flats as retirement nest eggs. But as the saying goes, the market can stay irrational longer than it can stay solvent. And in this case, the market is propped up by every injection of new grant and subsidy to keep this uneasy balance alive. Singapore's current approach seeks to engineer around the contradiction through increasingly sophisticated interventions. The prime housing experiment is an example of this. It is a major intervention to prolong this delicate balance, which was introduced in 2024, with standard, plus and prime models introduced. Its roots trace back to Pinnacle at Duxton in 2004, when Mabautan had to persuade his cabinet colleagues to keep this prime downtown location for public housing instead of selling it to private developers. The project was a statement about public housing's potential. These weren't utilitarian blocks. They were architectural landmarks with sky gardens and some of the best views in the city. But Pinnacle and Duxton revealed the lottery effects of location. Units now routinely trade for over $1 million, outperforming many private condominiums. The 2024 Prime Area Housing Model attempts to systematically manage this dynamic. Future flats in these prime locations came with 10-year minimum occupation periods and subsidy recovery mechanisms when the flat is sold. Yet, this creates a new kind of Frankenstein. The policy restricts immediate speculation but doesn't prevent long-term appreciation. A prime flat buyer still benefits from location value, just on a delayed timeline. So far, we've seen how public housing evolved through 4 major shifts, from solving homelessness to becoming investment to balancing this crisis and now to today's contradictions. But those shifts are only half the story. The real question is, what problems lie underneath the system and the ones that will shape its future? Because let's be clear, Singapore's public housing has succeeded beyond anyone's imaginations. These flats aren't just high quality. They sit within the ecosystem of malls, swimming pools, parks, and park connectors. As a holistic living environment, there's nothing quite like it anywhere else in the world. And that's exactly why the problems matter. Beneath the surface, 3 structural tensions have emerged that will determine where HDB goes from here. Let's lay these 3 tensions out clearly. The first, affordability. At the core of HDB lies a simple but difficult contradiction. Is housing supposed to be a roof over every Singaporean's head or a retirement nest egg? If prices rise, the nest egg mandate is served. Existing homeowners grow wealthier and can fund their retirement. But at the same time, price growth makes it harder for young families to buy into the housing market. Rising prices require larger subsidies to maintain affordability. And as more subsidies pump more money into the housing market, it pushes prices even higher. Yet, if prices fall, affordability improves but retirement security collapses. And unfortunately, both aims can't be achieved at the same time. The mathematics is unforgiving. For housing to be a good investment, it must appreciate faster than inflation. But for housing to remain affordable, it cannot outpace income growth. Every generation ends up stuck in the same trap. They need prices to rise and not rise at the same time. The government has tried to ease this paradox by diversifying retirement savings, expanding CPF life, and encouraging private savings. But culturally and financially, property remains really important. As with many other Asian societies, to keep the system afloat, policymakers reach for the 2 levers they've always leaned on: supply and demand. For supply, ramp up building when shortages bite. For demand, pumping grants and subsidies when prices surge. Expand eligibility and let singles buy earlier and let PRs into the market. Each tweak buys time, but each also feeds into an uneasy equilibrium that HDBs are built upon, even as the system has proven astonishingly adaptable in managing the contradictions. This is precisely why affordability feels less like a destination and more like a balancing act on quicksand. But affordability isn't the only thing at stake, because something important has shifted in what public housing represents: aspiration. Previous generations could choose between mansionettes, executive apartments, HUDC flats, or even DBSS schemes. These were more than just housing types. They represented the idea that HDB could cater to every stage of a Singaporean's life, from young family to outwardly mobile professionals to retiree. Today, HDB has largely retreated away from the upper middle of the market. Walk through, let's say, Toa Payoh today, and you see the remnants of this lost ambition. Mansionettes with double-story layouts and soaring ceilings, architectural flourishes that spoke to possibility rather than mere function. And these weren't accidents. They were statements that public housing could embody aspiration and not just necessity. Instead, HDB has left private developers to provide a sense of aspiration that once existed within the public housing system itself. And because private property prices have appreciated slightly faster than HDB levels, Singaporeans are increasingly forced into a precarious game. Learn to flip their flats, time the market, and hope to bridge the gap into private housing. That leap isn't just financial, it represents a deeper cultural shift. Because public housing no longer embodies as broad of a spectrum of Singaporeans' hope. The aspirational element, the idea that it could move outward within HDB, not just out of it, has also been gradually eroded. The result is a subtle loss. The idea that public housing could reflect the full spectrum of what Singaporeans dream their homes could be. And the retreat from aspirational HDB also means that status and aspiration are now spatially gated. Private condos physically separate communities, reversing the integrative spirit of earlier HDB planning. But if the loss of aspiration feels subtle and unspoken, the next problem is impossible to ignore. Because underneath all of this lies a countdown clock built into every HDB flat. is very leasehold. Every HDB flat was built on a 99-year leasehold. Policymakers defend this as fairness to future generations. Land returns to the state, gets recycled, and new homes are built with updated technology and planning. This also prevents hereditary divides between those who own property and those who don't. On its own, this bargain is tolerable. Few Singaporeans expect to own land forever in a land-scarce city. The anxiety builds when affordability falters, because the leasehold is only fair if it can reset into a new flat without being priced out. Complicating this is a hard physical limit. Lease extensions are possible in theory, but unlikely on the same site, because reinforced concrete which HDBs are built on simply don't last forever, especially in Singapore's humid climate. As architect Tay Kim Soon has argued, no engineer is likely to certify a HDB block much beyond 100 years. The steel rebars inside corrode, making demolition inevitable. With the way that HDBs are designed, this means that policymakers unfortunately cannot just sell more time by extending leases for a top-up fee. Renewal becomes a material necessity. To tackle this, the government has floated an ambitious solution, the Volunteer Early Redevelopment Scheme, or VERS. Redevelop estates before expiry, offer residents compensation and replacement flats, and manage the cycle proactively. But everything will hinge on the details: the compensation formula, the quality of the replacement housing, the voting threshold required to vote yes, and whether every estate will be offered the scheme. That's why the leasehold problem is about whether the cycle of renewal and affordability still holds together. If the state can keep its promise, the 99-year clock will potentially be accepted as part of Singapore's rhythm, because at the end of the day, the HDB is the foundation of Singapore's promise to its people. The question now is whether that promise, after decades of success, can withstand the new pressures bearing down on it. Singapore's housing system is still the envy of the world. It solved a crisis no one thought possible and gave generations of Singaporeans stability and dignity. Housing was one of Singapore's boldest bets, that it would be a ladder for social mobility, not a wall of division. That fairness and affordability could anchor unity across generations, and whether that promise still holds is a test of our time. And what other countries can we learn from? Austria, like Singapore, is often here for its really successful public housing, but it took a completely different path, building a rental-based model from the very beginning. And how did such a different system succeed? In my next video, I'll be sitting down with an Austrian expert to find out and to ask what lessons Singapore might learn from their experience. Thank you for watching. I'm Kian Chong. See you in the next video.